So I'm going to present two cases, and in a nutshell, one is warrant of fitness reform, so a vehicle example, carrying on from this morning, and the other is a case called leaky buildings, so a problem with the construction of particularly residential dwellings and long latency defects. And so, as I've got an economics background, if you look at the NPV of the warrant of fitness reforms, they are significant savings of New Zealand about $1.8 billion, which in US dollars would be about 1.6 billion. And it really is a case study of a reform that was robust, well-resourced, well-planned, well-executed, and amazingly, I've had a long experience as a kind of general manager of policy in a range of agencies in New Zealand. It actually went to plan. They actually planned out the program and it went to time. And the regulatory management system played a really interesting role in this case because directly it didn't play a particularly important role, but when I interviewed the people involved in how the reform was set up, designed and executed, they said it was a very useful piece of scaffolding. It provided a framework within which they could get on and manage the project, and it provided a source of strength when other people tried to raid them, for example, for resources. They're able to say, well, the regulatory management system requires that we do these things, no, you can't have those resources. So it contributed to the integrity of the process. So in the case of the warrant of fitness reforms, while the direct effect of the regulatory management system was quite limited, the indirect effect was quite important. So the second case study is a more difficult one, is leaky buildings. It's difficult because actually it played out over a long period of time, and at the time that it started, we didn't have a very well-developed regulatory management system in New Zealand. And so I had to sort of abstract from what it could have been like if it had played out in the current system. The regulatory management, the leaky buildings is really an example of a problem. It's a political problem because the losses are highly concentrated. And it's a failure in the way we designed the institutions and how we implemented the reform, which is something on which regulatory management systems, I think, struggle to add value in the case. So leaky buildings is an interesting second counterexample. Now, I don't want to spend very long talking about the actual cases, but sometimes a picture tells 1,000 words. So the case of the warrant fitness thing, if you can read the slide, which you most probably can't, but you've got the slides in front of you, you can see it's a reasonably, the timetable was basically the timetable they set out at the beginning of the project when they planned it. So they had a project setup stage, they got a lot of analysis and engagement, and at the same time the policy work was underway. But there was a lovely quote from one of the project managers: this was not a project where we began by writing the cabinet paper. So they really did do quite a lot of analysis. The options that were analysed morphed and changed as the project went through. There was a huge engagement process with stakeholders. There was a counter-engagement process from the automotive repair industry, because they stood to lose a lot of business. So they ran a publicity campaign called Hands Off the WAF, and reputedly they spent well over $1 million New Zealand dollars on that. So even when you run a good process of engagement based on real analysis, and the analysis was shared with the industry still lobbied to retain the rents because there was a large rents at stake. You then got into the decision-making phase where ministers decided to steer the industry down. Ministers actually changed the option, so the option that went in the cabinet paper was not the option that came out. Ministers finessed how it was going to be done, which is kind of interesting. And there's some evidence to suggest that actually the RIS was quite important in helping get the reform over the line. Because the RIS actually requires that you focus on the impact of the reforms. In politics, there's often about winners and losers, and so they've done a lot of very, very detailed analysis. I mean, detailed. So they use geospatial data to look at which garages we're going to lose what share of business. And when you're a minister working out how you're going to get something through, that's very useful information to work out if you can pull it off. And that was something that the analysts had done, partly because, partly for internal reasons, but partly because it was a requirement for the regulatory backstop. And then you've got the kind of classic kind of operational policy rollout, implementation, and although there isn't, it's sufficiently recent, so there's no review that I can report. A review is proposed to see if the reforms have worked as they planned. So that's kind of case study one, a kind of a classic, regular, predictable policy cycle. It's like a textbook case. I've been involved in a huge number of reforms over the years. I've never seen a policy process work in this orderly way. The other one is leaky buildings, which I call a slow train crash. A very long elapsed period of time. A large consultation process at the front. It's actually the industry that wanted to move away from input-based controls towards prescriptive, towards more performance code. Wide consultation agreement about that, about the need to move in that direction. So that was then enacted. And then you have the problem of latent defects. So you have these, so the claddings that were, New Zealand's very wet. We have a lot of rainfall and we have quite a lot of wind. And some innovative people picked up some designs out of a Mediterranean climate and brought them into New Zealand. They also brought them into California, Oregon, and the west coast of Canada. After a while, people started finding there were problems. It took us quite a long time to find there were problems. And in fact, we're most probably lucky because we made more than one change at the moment, and one of the other changes we made was we introduced untreated timber. And when you introduced untreated timber, it became much more obvious, much more quickly that you had a problem. So if we hadn't made two bad reforms, if we'd only done one, we possibly still wouldn't really know that we have the problem. Because it's a latent, it's a slow train crash, it takes a long time to come out. So the problems started emerging first in Canada, and then on the west coast of the United States. And the New Zealand industry, the New Zealand regulators were very slow to respond to that. And eventually the story broke almost 10 years after the reform, the building code had gone in. And then you get, Pons, you were talking before lunch about sort of a reflexive process. You get a process of reviews and legislative changes that's going to fix the problem, and another review and another set of legislation. And the graphic deliberately has a timeline that stretches out to the right, because I'm sure if we came back in 10 years, we'd have more pieces of legislation. So that, the problem continues to unwind. So that's why I call it a slow train crash. So what was the role of the regulatory management system in those two cases? Well, in the case of the warrant of fitness reform, as I said, it provided a scaffold. It provided a framework within which a classic policy process could then unfold. But interestingly, the people involved in the project said the regulatory management system played an important role, albeit an indirect one. Which elements did they? In the elements tables, which were the elements that they particularly highlighted? One was the whole notion of regulatory policy principles. That when the interesting thing about warrant of fitness reform is when I started doing the research, the first thing I did was I went onto our little knowledge set within the organisation that I work in, and I looked up warrant of fitness. And I found a cost-benefit analysis that NZIA had done for the precursor transport organisation a decade ago, saying warrant of fitness should be reformed, and said the NPV from doing that was quite large. So the idea was not a new one. The idea that New Zealand needed to move away from one of the most draconian licensing and inspection regimes for vehicles in any OECD country was not new, but it took some particular set of events to get it on the agenda and to get it driven through. And one of those was a government committed to regulatory reform and saying these are the principles that we'll be using, and it helped those elements within the organisation that wanted to drive it through, get it through. The second was the whole, the emphasis on big policy design and the role of a RIA, regulatory impact analysis. And again, that buttressed the desire of the project managers to, the requirement, it's kind of, regulatory management is meta-regulation, it's regulating the regulators. And having a meta rule that you have to produce a RIA strengthened the hand of those that wanted to do a really professional job of the policy process. And so the other question we have to think about on each of these case studies is, well, if you had a perfect regulatory management system in the world, what would it look like and what difference would that have made to this case? And it seemed to me in this case that it's about the old Sherlock Holmes thing, that when Sherlock Holmes solves the case and they ask, how did you work it out? And he said, the dog didn't bark. And he works out that clearly whoever did the crime was an insider because the dogs would have barked if it was an outsider. So what was the dog that didn't bark in this case? Well, the dog that didn't bark in this case was the pressure to get a large regulatory impost upon New Zealanders moving more quickly. So the regulators did clearly not feel under pressure to move on getting rid of warrant fitness reform from the regulatory management system. So the kind of a requisite system would put more pressure on more actively managing the stock. So that's my success story. The leaky buildings is an interesting one because it was a very thorough engagement process with the industry. There was a reasonably thorough policy process. So it's not clear that a regulatory impact statement or a regulatory impact analysis would have made any difference to the outcome. A, because I think politically the reforms would have gone through anyway. But B, an ex-ante desktop analysis would not have unpacked a problem which was as complex and difficult to envisage as this one. Because it was a very complex interaction between weather conditions, cladding and application practices of builders that caused the problem. And that's not something that a policy processes generally go through. So which elements of the regulatory management system would have mattered? One clearly is better monitoring. It was hard. It's a hard problem to detect. But the interesting thing about this case was other jurisdictions that had made similar reforms problems did surface, and New Zealand was slow to respond to that information and see if it was replicated in New Zealand, which it was. And which elements of a requisite system would have made a difference? Well, again, it's the same one, which is greater pressure on stock management. So in summary, if you stand back from the two cases, if you think about regulatory management systems, they're quite high-powered in terms of the expectations of what I call big policy, the kind of policy analysis that you'd expect to see. And in the case of warranty fitness, it made a good policy process more robust. The policy process without the regulatory management system would most probably have run, but it made it more robust and it helped getting it over the line politically. Leaky buildings, by contrast, is where I think plays to the problems where most regulatory management systems struggle, which is in implementation and in regulatory capability. So the case I run in my paper is the regulatory management system would not have made any difference to whether New Zealand went the way of the performance-based building code. We would have had leaky buildings anyway. And that brings out an interesting thing about regulations, that they're kind of something of the nature of an experiment. And we actually don't know, because you're dealing often with complicated systems. Sometimes you're dealing with complicated physical systems, and then you're dealing with human systems. So how human actors will change in response to change in policy settings is difficult to be sure in advance. So there's somewhat of a paradox, I think, in the New Zealand case, which is that where our regulatory management system is strongest is at the point where we know least about how regulations are going to work.